The year is 1806. You are governor of Indiana and future president William Henry Harrison. A man calling himself a prophet has started causing quite the stir among the Shawnee. A literal witch hunt is on, targeting mostly, but not exclusively, United States sympathizers. One of the recent victims was an elderly leader of a tribe that has traditionally been quick to seek peace with the U.S. The man was named Chief Tecumseh of the Lenape, though you know them as the Delaware because, again, you are William Henry Harrison. Sorry about that. Now, you hate this guy. This Shawnee Prophet has been a thorn in your side for about a year now. More and more tribal leaders seem to be drawn to his idea of a unified Indian front. What's worse, his brother, Tecumseh, would go on to become a very famous warrior. But you don't know that yet because, again, you're William Henry Harrison. So it's time for you to deliver a speech. You go before the Lenape Nation. You tell them to come to their senses. You demand that this prophet prove how powerful he really is. This is what you say. But who is this pretended prophet who dares to speak in the name of the great creator? If he really is a prophet, ask of him to cause the sun to stand still, the moon to alter its course, the rivers to cease to flow, or the dead to rise from their graves. Okay, so you can take a break from being William Henry Harrison for a second. Let's examine the prophet's perspective. A direct threat to your validity has just been issued. But you are a smart man. You see an opportunity. After all, only a prophet could move the moon or blot out the sun. So that is what you do. Maybe it was divine intervention. Maybe you were simply better informed than Mr. Harrison. Either way, you know something he doesn't. There's a solar eclipse coming. Astronomers have known about the total solar eclipse that will pass over Ohio for quite a while now, so you make a plan. You invite as many people as you can to come see you in Greenville. You sit. You wait. You only emerge from your wigwam at the exact correct moment. Pointing to the sky, you dare anyone to disbelieve you now. In his own way, the Shawnee Prophet really did blot out the sun from the sky that day. In the couple of decades between the War for Independence and the War of 1812, the United States hadn't really proven itself. It was still very much in the experimentation phase, and there were a lot of foreign nations that didn't really take kindly to this new fledgling democracy. Among them were native nations like the Shawnee. The British had promised that American settlers wouldn't cross the Appalachian Mountains, and formally, the American government has stuck to this. But the Appalachian Mountains are hundreds of miles away from Washington, and that's even if their courts care. It's commonly known and discussed that native peoples would raid white settlements and attack white caravans. But what we often gloss over is that white Americans were just as likely to strike, and strike first. By the time the Shawnee Prophet is around, attacks on random civilian traders from the native nations had already started. Even before the country won its independence, white settlers attacked and murdered peaceful Indian parties quite frequently. And when native leaders would reach out to local governments for justice, they were only met with hostility. Discussing the murder of a group of Mingo traders, then Governor of Indiana William Henry Harrison said, quote, "A great many of the inhabitants of the frontier consider the murdering of Indians in the highest degree of meritorious." This was the world in which he was born, and he was comfortable with it. Plus, it only served Harrison's interests for there to be more settlers in his territory. Really, from Harrison's perspective, the disruption of this system in any way would be difficult and pointless. Harrison stood with the majority of American politicians when he thought the natives might as well just hurry up and surrender. But they didn't surrender, and we shouldn't forget that. In 1801, John Adams appointed Harrison as the governor of the Indiana Territory. It was really only a few short years before Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa would start to give him hell. Of this well-known pair of Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh is definitely the more famous. Alongside Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and of course, Pocahontas, Tecumseh is one of the most famous Native Americans that there are. And for good reason. As we will see, he was a shrewd and effective politician, a capable and experienced warrior, and perhaps most importantly, a man who dreamed that a united Indian front could keep the white settlers at bay. But if you ask me, it's a shame more people don't talk about his brother. Also known as the Shawnee Prophet, Tenskwatawa has mostly been written over as a sort of secondary character. A man that mostly derailed and undermined Tecumseh's efforts, an unreasonable man. But really, during the early years of this pan-Indian movement, it was Tenskwatawa the prophet, and not his brother, who held most of the attention. It was less than 10 years before Tecumseh was born that the Shawnee had been invited back to the Ohio River Valley by the British. Tecumseh's parents met in what is modern-day Alabama. You see, at the time, it was pretty common for foreign interests to use the native nations like pawns on a chessboard and scatter them across the continent. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's parents had been among only some of the Shawnee who chose to return to the valley, and for a time, they had peace. Unfortunately, white settlers were becoming more and more interested in their land. Peace would not last. In 1774, their father was killed in battle. In 1772, their brother and mentor would follow. 2 years later, Tecumseh was finally old enough to fight, but he lost, and most of modern-day Ohio was ceded in what would later be called the Greenville Treaty. By the time he came into conflict with Harrison, Tecumseh was a weathered man. He had seen firsthand how both war and peace were designed by the Americans to erode the native lands. It was because of treaties like this that Tecumseh would argue until the day he died that no tribe could sell land because it was held in common. He argued that it made just as much sense as selling the sky or the air you breathe. Tenskwatawa walked a different path. At birth, he was given the name Lalawethika, a name that means something like the noisemaker or the rattler. And from a young age, Lalawethika had a difficult time in life. Seriously, you look up any biography on this guy, and you would think the modern authors have something out for him. At a young age, he took out his own eye with a bow and arrow, and he would continue to be known for his tendency to make mistakes until he became an adult and a self-proclaimed drunk. But in November of 1805, that would all change. Lalawethika, the inept drunk, would go to sleep one night and wake up 3 days later as Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee Prophet. Lalawethika's wife found him lying on the floor, still, staring into a fire. When she attempted to wake him, he didn't move. In fact, no one could get him to wake. So, thinking he was dead, arrangements were made for a funeral. Then, after 2 days of not stirring, Lalawethika awoke and told a story of how he saw heaven. It was only now that he renamed himself Tenskwatawa, meaning open door. The idea was that, like a door, he would lead the Shawnee to heaven. And so, the prophet began preaching to and sometimes purifying the Shawnee and other nearby natives. It was at this point that Tenskwatawa, and by extension his brother, caught the attention of Governor Harrison. Only a year later, Harrison would issue that challenge to prove himself a prophet that we talked about earlier in this video. Now, to a modern person, an eclipse isn't really anything out of the ordinary. Sure, they're really cool, but we know what they are. But imagine if you weren't a modern viewer, and one day, this guy from a nearby village told you that the sun would go away. Whether you believed him or not, when it did, that would be scary. So, even though Tenskwatawa probably did have the help of modern science, it was a miracle. The 1806 eclipse was a turning point. Many who had doubted became ardent supporters. Many who would have disagreed had already been found to be witches by Tenskwatawa and killed. The Shawnee cause and Shawnee influence swelled, and with it, the brothers' hopes at an effective strike against the Americans. But Mr. Harrison had not been lying dormant during this period. On the contrary, he might not have been dealing with the Shawnee brothers, but he had been continually scheming and swindling. Through a series of just 3 treaties, Harrison had acquired for $100,000 what one historian valued at 600 times that. The governor had gotten so much land that settlers simply couldn't keep up. So, when Tenskwatawa humiliates him on an international stage, you can imagine the young and ambitious governor truly took it to heart. Not only that, but these 2 brothers and their allies, while not technically in Harrison's territory, are operating out of Greenville. Now I know what you're thinking. Who cares about Greenville, Indiana? Well, first of all, rude. Second of all, keep up. We're talking about the much more important Greenville, Ohio. Now, those of you who've been paying very close attention might be able to see where I'm going with this. Greenville was one of the places where one of the treaties that I talked about earlier was signed. And according to the Treaty of Greenville, Greenville is part of the U.S. And so the Shawnee have no right to live there. But what makes it even more insulting from Harrison's perspective is that he was there. Now, Tenskwatawa had known this when he set up in Greenville in 1805, and so did Tecumseh when he joined him a bit later. In fact, we know Tecumseh was invited and refused to attend in protest. But Tenskwatawa was probably there. It's hard to say for sure the reason why they picked this location. From this time on, Tenskwatawa would only really speak as a prophet, and prophets don't really announce their political motivations. But it's probably safe to guess that the selection of this location was meant to invoke a reaction, and that it did. Native leaders, American military, and British Indian agents all made their way to this village outside of Greenville to greet the new prophet. In 1807, another extremely influential native spiritual leader, Main Pak of the Potawatomis, made a pilgrimage to meet the Shawnee leader. He didn't agree to everything Tenskwatawa had to say. He did not agree to subjugate himself to the Shawnee Confederacy as Tenskwatawa may have liked, and after he left, he spent some time at Fort Wayne, where he was the target of a lot of American effort to sway him away from the prophet. But it definitely wasn't a negative interaction. He left with a generally positive note, and he would go on to spread word of this new faith back home. It was in this way that Tenskwatawa helped Tecumseh build his movement, not through war alliances or meetings with foreign dignitaries, but by bringing the hearts of the people under one faith, asking them to see themselves as one culture. And, as the American military noticed at the time, Tenskwatawa was too successful for his own good. There were many mouths to feed in Greenville. Eventually, the movement would fall under the weight of its own hunger. But the military wouldn't be able to celebrate this news for too long, because they would soon learn that the prophet and his followers were moving west, into Indiana, where they would found Prophetstown. In 1808, the Shawnee brothers and their large following of political allies and religious followers would make their way west to the mouth of the Tippecanoe River. Their small village outside of Greenville was just too small, and the local white settlers were too aggressive. Here, they would begin construction on a new city, a city where they hoped to bring thousands of Native Americans across dozens of tribal nations under a single banner. The formation of Prophetstown was a diplomatic and strategic move just as much as it was a religious one. When Tecumseh traveled to Canada, meeting with British officials and requesting supplies for the city's construction, he said so himself. The prophet is endeavoring to collect the different nations to form one settlement on the Wabash, 300 miles south of Amherstburg, in order to preserve their country from all encroachments. That their intention at the moment is not to take part in the quarrels of white people. That if the Americans encroach upon them, they are resolved to strike. But he added that if their father the king should be in earnest and appear in sufficient force, that they would hold fast by him. Sure, setting up a new town gave them more control, and it distanced them from the settlers who they were fighting with, but Greenville was in Ohio. Prophetstown is in Indiana. You can imagine Harrison was at first alarmed to have this sort of ticking time bomb under his watch. But from another perspective, he now had the opportunity to strike back. He had the chance to hit these two brothers whose coalition threatened him and his power and his legacy. Shortly after his arrival in Prophetstown, Tenskwatawa would send a delegation to meet with the governor and reassure him of their peaceful intentions. He said it was, quote, never his intention to lift his hand against the Americans. In response, Harrison replied, "You may rest satisfied that you will continue to enjoy the comfort and protection of the United States." Both parties left convinced they had pulled the wool over the eyes of the other. Prophetstown was also a signal of things to come. Just as many had been expecting, a war would ignite over the Ohio River Valley and other tensions just a few years later. We know it as the War of 1812. But just before and leading into the War of 1812 was Tecumseh's War. Tecumseh's War was in many ways a part of the War of 1812, and so it can kind of be said that the War of 1812 started before 1812. Tecumseh and the other Ohio River Valley natives would seek support from the Canadians and the British in order to reclaim their land from the Americans. So, the picture I've been painting so far has been mostly neutral or even sometimes positive. But as you know, there is no Shawnee Confederation today. So what happened? Well, as I've kind of been alluding to already, one of the greatest enemies of the Brothers movement wasn't disease or military involvement, not at first. Though both of these certainly affected things, the largest problem for the Confederation was to solve logistics. The movement had been very successful, and that was fantastic, but Prophetstown now had a ton of mouths to feed, and it didn't have roads or supply lines in place to support them. This wasn't new to Tenskwatawa. They'd run into this problem in Greenville as well. Their plan had been to farm the land, but in the fall of 1808, the Tippecanoe didn't produce enough corn to feed the Prophet's masses. But Tenskwatawa had allies and hoped that in this time of need, they would be able to provide support. Mainpock had promised to send aid himself, but a last-minute invitation to spend the winter in Washington, D.C. left him there through the winter, unable to help. So, with little supplies, they hunkered down. Through the winter of 1808 through 1809, they suffered considerable casualties. Not only that, here in Prophetstown, death seemed to discriminate. Now, it's very hard to say why, but whatever the reason, when the winter came to an end, 160 Ottawas and Chippewas had died, but only 5 Shawnee. So the Northerners were rightfully distressed, and they fled, calling Tenskwatawa a prophet of evil. They would even return with a war party in 1809, only to be stopped by the American military of all people. But soon, hungry mouths to feed would be the least of Tenskwatawa's concerns. Other native nations from the south and southwest had agreed to a peaceful negotiation and signed away a considerable amount of land in 1809. This treaty, for Tecumseh, was the last straw. In 1809, Harrison met with a number of tribal chiefs who had all come willingly to sell their land in hopes of maintaining peace with the Americans. The only present tribe that was opposed were the Miami, who brought a copy of the Treaty of Greenville and argued that this land was already theirs based on this previous treaty. That would not stop Harrison. The man seems to have had something to prove. Maybe it was from that initial spite against him with the eclipse. Maybe he was just a very ambitious governor. Whatever the reason, through this period and this region, nearly every treaty signed with the natives which ceded land to the U.S. was a treaty proposed and acquired by William Henry Harrison. Tecumseh knew this. So, after this new treaty, the Treaty of Fort Wayne of 1809, the Shawnee leader had had enough. He gathered a few hundred warriors, leading them south where he would meet with Harrison in 1810. Tecumseh laid into Harrison, citing all the injustices the United States had inflicted on the native nations. When Harrison tried to rebut his argument, Tecumseh reacted quite furiously. He started shouting in his native tongue, and a few of Harrison's party drew their pistols. In response, Tecumseh's party drew their weapons as well, and the whole meeting very nearly turned violent. Thankfully, it didn't. The meeting was adjourned, and they reconvened the next morning. Tecumseh would go on to tell Harrison more. He claimed he alone was the chief of all tribes. He threatened the lives of those who had signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Their blood would be on Harrison's hands if the treaty was not annulled. Lastly, he said if the treaty was not annulled, he would seek a formal alliance with the British. The following year, Tecumseh would seek allies in the south, but while he was gone, Harrison would take advantage. He led a battalion of 1,000 soldiers on Prophetstown while their leader was away. When Tenskwatawa heard the troops were coming, he knew they weren't there to greet the Shawnee peacefully, even though that's what the Americans told him. Tecumseh had told him not to incite violence yet, but with a force so massive on his doorstep, the Prophet disregarded his advice. Striking at night, Tenskwatawa led the Shawnee against the Americans in the Battle of Tippecanoe. Though the Shawnee would sustain less casualties, they also had a smaller force. And so 2 hours after their initial attack, they fled. Harrison laid waste to Prophetstown, wiping it off the map, and that was that. The Shawnee Confederation would not recover from this point on. When he found Prophetstown in ruin, Tecumseh was distraught. He joined the British and led battle after battle against the Americans. He fought alongside the British Canadians in the War of 1812, and he proved to be vital to their success at keeping their territory in the Great Lakes region. For this reason, Tecumseh became something of a folk hero in parts of Canada. Unfortunately, he wouldn't see this for himself. Tecumseh was killed fighting in the War of 1812, and with him died his dream of a Shawnee Confederation. Tenskwatawa lived on well after the war. He continued to preach as a prophet, but if he was the one to start the movement, Tecumseh was the one who ended it. The prophet moved to a reservation in Kansas, eventually, where he would live out the rest of his days. After the War of 1812, Harrison's political career skyrocketed. For his success against the brothers, people started calling Harrison Old Tippecanoe. He would ride this success into the Senate in 1824 and into the presidency in 1840. The legacy of the conflict between these men carries much more weight to the modern day than you might think. Sure, there isn't one single United Native American States of America, but in 1912, the brothers' ideas helped create what would result in the first conference of the Society of American Indians. Today, the NCAI, or National Congress of American Indians, still carries this vision and legacy, even though their vision might not have come true. It's important to honor and remember that men and women, sometimes very talented ones, fought for and died over the land that was ceded to American colonists. History is very complicated, and it's almost impossible to know what would have happened had things gone differently. But the path west through the Appalachian Mountains by white settlers was right from the start a road paved with the blood of those who died fighting for a freedom of their own.